Praise be to Jesus Christ and welcome to Catholic Forum. I'm your host, Deacon Jim Thorndale. I'd like to welcome all those who are joining us on public TV and those who might be hearing us through podcast. It's always our privilege to be with you. You know, it's an understanding that you allow us into your homes or even into your car or wherever you may be, that we have the honor to really continue our conversation about our Catholic faith and living in a Catholic faith. And what does that mean? Many times it means that we have to be a little bit of a history professor along the way, because not to know the history of who we are does not allow us to grow into who we can become. And so it's really vitally important that we know our faith so that we can grow and help others to grow. And that's the reason for sharing of our faith. It's really that we become apologists and catechists for those who really need to have that experience of the Catholic Church. Today I have just such a person with me today, and he can help us along this way. I have Dr. John Pinheiro. It's nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. You know, we talk about our Catholic faith as if it's just osmosis. We just have it and that's it. But it's really much deeper than that, because it's really something that we have to really delve into and learn and be taught. Is that not correct?
I think so. I think there was a time in Catholic history, or at least some now would believe, and I'm not sure it's entirely correct, something like the 13th century, where we might have such a fully formed Catholic culture that you really could simply imbibe it.
Exactly.
We certainly don't have that today by any means, and so we have the remains, I would say, of a Christian culture in the West, and America is part of that.
That's right.
And that means that's going to translate into our Catholic faith, and maybe those things of my generation, your generation, the parents' generation, going back to my grandparents, that they may have taken for granted. We can't take those things for granted, that they're being communicated.
John, before we get into that, in depth on that, you know, I think people would like to really understand who John is.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Well, you know, it's important because, you know, you're one of those enigmas, we might say. You're one of these reverts that really kind of left the faith, right? And really had a rebirth in it.
Yes.
Kind of tell us about that.
Well, I was what Father Stan would call an emerging adult in college, but
We're cradle Catholic?
I was a cradle Catholic, raised in a Portuguese-American family. My grandfather was from Portugal on my dad's side, and so I had some very, very faithful grandparents on both sides of the family who prayed me back into the faith, I think. And so short of college, I had left the faith. I kind of went through the motions of confirmation without, I don't know what my level of belief was.
Okay.
And I never would want to blame my catechist along the way, but we played with a lot of felt on felt in the 1970s and early 1980s. And
let me ask, I interject, but were you going through any Catholic schools?
I was not in Catholic school, but I was in CCD growing up and went through all the right classes and did confirmation kind of because I was supposed to. Was the main thing at that point. Although I did pick the name Luke, I recall, because he was an historian, and even then I thought,
kind of a prominent name in the Bible.
Pick Luke for my confirmation name. It was in college when I encountered the intellectual Catholic faith. The early Christian fathers, Augustine, and more modern writers like Maritain and Thomas Merton. And that's what really started to draw me back.
Did C.S. Lewis ever enter the picture for you? Or not so much?
No. I never read Lewis till much later. In graduate school, I read Mere Christianity, but I was already a Christian and back in the Catholic Church by then. But what I was reading was the Desert Fathers and the early Church Fathers, and they were such heavily intellectual men and reasonable men, and compelling arguments for the faith, and compelling arguments to have faith, and explaining what faith is and what it isn't. And so it was largely through, it was actually an Episcopal priest who turned me on to reading Thomas Merton at the time.
Is that right?
This was in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I was getting serious with my now wife, then girlfriend, and we knew we wanted probably to be in a church somewhere. And so we attended an evangelical church for a few years, and the milk was good for a while, and then we wanted meat, and there wasn't any.
You start to miss something in that. While you were away from the church in your early years of college, correct? Is that really when you kind of really became more walking away from the church?
I didn't lose. I found my faith in college. I kind of had lost it to some degree before I entered college. And then in college, I was very serious about pursuing truth, which is maybe why I ended up at a Dominican college.
Exactly.
But I was very serious about it, and so I investigated all sorts of religions. But it was really the Catholic faith that was always pulling at me.
You know, that's important. You said something highly important, at least to me, is that you investigated other religions. And I think that when you do that comparative understanding of different faiths, you begin to have a revelation of deeper truth in what you're seeing in the Catholic Church, because you're starting to understand that there is a history to it. And there's some, like you said, there's some meat on the bone when you start to really delve into that. What was really the most awakening time for you during those college years?
I think it was reading, when I read Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, and it's his conversion experience, a very famous autobiography from the mid-20th century. And when I read that, I just kept thinking of myself, and I kept seeing my own story in it, except I didn't end up in a Cistercian monastery. But I kept seeing my own story in that, and I thought, this man really thinks, and he has a great imagination, and that led me into Augustine and many other writers, but mainly just then reading Scripture after Merton. Okay. And so I did a degree in religious studies and took as many classes on Christian history and Christian thought as I could.
Here may be a tough question. You know, you leave the church, you go to college. What makes you start thinking about faith again? I mean, you could have picked up a book on astrology. You could have picked a book up on the history of whatever. I mean, it didn't have to be Christianity, but something obviously was drawing you back into this mystery of the church.
One of the things Cardinal Newman wrote, which we were talking about before the program, when he wrote to be deep in history is to be Catholic. Yes. And so the more I studied history, the more I realized that while the evangelical church we were attending was really good at making baby Christians and introducing the idea, which I had not heard of before, of a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Well, they're very good at many things and better at hospitality than many Catholic churches.
They're better at casseroles and all that stuff than me.
I don't know about better at casseroles in the Polish churches, but they're good at those things. But there was always this sense of a reinvention of the wheel. Yeah. There was one time I recall after a service where they were going to gather together if you wanted to go to the pastor and just kind of talk about troubles you were having, and then he would pray over you. And I thought, that's nice, but I'd rather go to confession if I could. I mean, I had a sense that there's a real sacrament there, and we're not just talking about stuff when we go in the confessional.
That's the throwback from your Catholicism.
That's the throwback, but it was also what I would say that I was learning in the classes. This is the church history, and it's not what they're saying it is.
Right.
And it's not what well-meaning but historically ignorant people think it is. Right. I mean, here we have from the words of Justin Martyr what the Eucharist is and is not, and it's from the 2nd century. Yes. Right, from right at the time, just past the apostles. Yeah. And that was really all I needed. So it took another look at the Catholic Church, and my wife and I were married in 92, and I re-entered the church in 93, and she went through RCIA in 94, and there we went.
And I would suggest, and I've known you for a while now, John, that your faith is probably so strong and unshakable now, really, because you've come at it from an intellectual and a spiritual sense, probably the best of both worlds, because God infused you with this wisdom. Once you really decided to come back into the church, that beautiful gift of wisdom starts to become so evident in people, particularly in you. You've really done a marvelous job in that. I want to talk about that with the people who are watching us too, because you've done some marvelous things in the Catholic Church right now. And tell us what's going on with you right now in your journey into where you're at right now and what you're doing.
For the church?
Well, both your professional life and
my professional life. I've been at Aquinas College for 11 years. Okay. I was hired to be a history professor. And my specialty is early American history. And when I
go back to your degrees, where are your degrees out of?
I did my PhD at the University of Tennessee, where I studied the Mexican-American War, because that is where the papers of James K. Polk, who was president during that war, are housed. And so that's where I did my PhD. I did my undergraduate and master's level work at California State, Bakersfield, where I grew up, and where my wife grew up too.
Okay, well, wonderful.
So I moved to Tennessee and never moved back.
Never moved back. So now, I didn't get to, you were born and raised in California?
California, yes.
And you're now a Michigander.
As well as I can be, yes.
How did that happen?
Well, I wanted to teach at a small Catholic college, and my first job out of graduate school was working at the University of Virginia as a research professor on the papers of George Washington, and I edited one volume of that, and we had a really good time working there at Mr. Jefferson's University, and got to present that book to President Bush in the Oval Office. And
Wonderful.
That was very exciting. But I really wanted to be...
I believe I've seen that picture.
Maybe so, somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know where.
Didn't we have it at Holy Family Radio?
I don't know.
I believe it was there.
Oh, but what I wanted to be around students, and I wanted to be at a liberal arts college, and I think you can only do the liberal arts well at a Christian college, and especially a Catholic college, to form that whole human person. And so...
explore that a little bit, because that's a good comment. Because there is a limitation if it's not a Christian college.
I think so. So I feel much more freer academically at a Catholic college than I would at a secular college. And I know that I'm more free to teach there. So I'm not limited in the ways I can seek truth. I'm not limited in the truths I can talk about. And because I believe, as Thomas Aquinas talked about, in the unity of all truth, that's what we do in the classroom, especially in history. We want to find out the truth about the human person. So I do names and dates like other history classes, but we really like to talk about the big questions in my classes, and about just the human story. And we're all part of that story, and we all enter it at a certain point and leave it at a certain point, and the church is part of that story too, and everything interacts in this great story.
So in your classroom, would the students have the ability to hear you talk about church history as it relates to human history?
I direct a Catholic Studies program at Aquinas College that I founded back in 2008 as an effort to integrate the faith more fully in the curriculum. We created some new classes, and the capstone class for Catholic Studies is a class I teach called The Christian View of History, based on the studies of Christopher Dawson and G.K. Chesterton and a few other folks who looked at history as the unfolding of the church in time, and as St. John Paul said, with the incarnation at the center of history and things leading up to it and events leading towards the end. And we know how history ends, and we know how it began as Christians. And so in that class, we talk quite a bit about church history. In my American history classes, I do things like compare the Dred Scott decision to the Roe versus Wade decision in terms of having something like a court try to define what a human is and which humans get rights and which don't. So there's a lot of ways you can approach this, but I would never consider myself a church historian. I mean, I'm a Catholic and an educated Catholic who's interested in church history, but it's not my specialty as an historian.
How do you see the students at the university? How do they assimilate when you start talking about you said Roe versus Wade and all that? Are they engaging in those discussions on an intellectual level that you see that you might not have in a secular college?
I don't know. It's hard to compare.
Yeah.
It's hard to compare, not having been in a secular college for any given length of time teaching. I have done quite a bit of adjunct work.
But you were in a secular. Were you ever in a secular college yourself?
But oh yes.
Yeah.
And my whole education is secular, except for my personal education, which I had to do after graduate school and in between school, and where you read the good stuff that I'm able to assign at Aquinas, and that good organizations like the Intercollegiate Studies Institute have book lists for students to read in case they're not getting the college education they deserve, as ISI puts it. So your question?
No, the question was that these students are open to these discussions.
Oh, so how open are they?
Yeah.
Right. Well, it depends, and it seems cyclical with certain classes and groups, and some classes, if all the students are required to take American History Survey or a World History Survey, they might be less interested in the history.
Okay.
But the history majors especially, and especially those in the Catholic Studies program, I find they are interested. I will admit they don't seem as interested in the deep spiritual questions or questions about truth that I recall me and my friends being interested in when we were in college. And maybe I just don't see it in them, but I wonder if it's generational. And it's something to be concerned about, and how to awaken in them that natural curiosity, because they're created to seek and know the truth, but there's there's a lot of junk on top that they really have to sift through.
In many ways, too, it's our culture that adds that junk on top, because they really get bombarded with a lot of cultural stuff that never really weighs into the understanding of truth, who God is and who God the Father is for them. You know, I listen to the conversations you're having with your students. What's your hope for the youth in the colleges? What do you see? What's your hope for the youth that they'll...
My hope is, when I came to Aquinas, my mentor was Dr. Bob Marco, who's still the head of head of theology there, and he said his main concern is just about souls, and that's really all you should worry about. And that was pretty good advice. So my main concern is always that. So I don't want to be a stumbling block, and I don't want the college to be a stumbling block. And I want them to learn their history, because it's their story. And without being liberated by the liberal arts, the opposite of being liberated is being enslaved. And so they're enslaved to the present.
That's right.
And to the culture of death, and to kind of the myopic progressivism that thinks everything behind us is bad, even if they don't know what's behind us, and everything in front of us is good. And I'd like to, in a small way, pull them out of that. But ultimately, I love the C students as much as the A students, and want them all at least to have a deeper faith by the time they leave, and not lose their faith, as many students do in college, if studies are to be believed. Yeah, we were just talking about that prior with some of the people from Aquinas College, and the constant battle to hold on to that faith, to have them recognize. I think I mentioned before that I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Al Cresta. I don't know if you've ever heard of Al Cresta. Yes, I
And Al Cresta, in college, really walked away from his Catholic faith. He's a revert also. And I asked Al... I thought Al was a convert. I didn't know that. Maybe I'm trying to recall now. Perhaps he is a convert. But anyways, I asked Al, what happened? How did you come back? He said, I finally realized that Jesus was who he said he was. Mm-hmm. And so he had that intellectual conversion, really, that you're talking about too. But then he started to have this experience with the Lord. I think many times students today don't have an appreciation of history, like you're talking about, because history to them can seem dry and bland, and they don't see the relevance to their lives. Describe what history is and the relevance of a student's life. What it ought to be? Yeah, or what it ought to be. It's relevant, they just don't realize it. Well, what it ought to be is for them to look at particularly American history, because we're in the United States, or Western civilization, because we're part of Western civilization. What it ought to be is realize that these are the events that form the society around them, and the culture that shapes them for good or ill, and it's like knowing their own family history. I use a student's guide to U.S. history written by Wilfred McClay in my classes, and he says things like, look, if you didn't know your history, you wouldn't be able to find your way home. That's right. Where did you leave your car? He uses all these wonderful comparisons and metaphors to try to show them that, as Cicero put it, he said not to know history is always to be a child. So you're a permanent child if you don't know your history. Now, does that mean you have to be a Civil War buff or perfectly know all the names and dates and get all the centuries right? No, it doesn't, but it does help, history does help ward against participating in utopian schemes, or trying to build heaven on earth, which usually, as Russell Kirk has said, ends up hell on earth. That's right. And trying to do those kinds of things. It helps guard against that, because you see there's not a lot new under the sun, as the Bible says, in terms of what the human person is and isn't, and what government can and cannot accomplish. And so we just try to be good and do good and get to heaven, and then we're done. Well, it may be a little simplified, but I kind of like that. But you make a good point, because to be without the knowledge of history is really to not be able to grow, because it allows us to really analyze what happened in the past, so maybe we can correct some of the mistakes that happened. And it's to be a slave. I've learned I know nothing from the past. I'm a slave to the present, or maybe to my own appetites, my own desires, and that's what I need to be liberated from. And that's why I had said earlier that to try to provide a liberal arts education in a secular environment ignores what the human person is. And so without that Christian anthropology, I don't think you can provide a real and holistic liberal arts education. I want to take it to a different avenue, perspective too, because Many times I've heard parents say, and I've asked them about it, whether you're going to have your child baptized, say, I'm going to let my children grow up and make that decision later on down the road without giving them any history of who they are, of the background of the faith they grew up in, and it's almost as if to say, I have nothing to offer you to help you on your journey. And that's a sadness to me, because there's so much richness in the faith of our, in the journey of our faith and who we are, that it begins to form our person. And we become an understanding of we're not just a bunch of amoebas and cells running around, but we're something that God has created. And I think that's important for parents to understand that history.
Yes, so I'm obligated to talk about the student's history. That the parents are obligated then to show the history of their faith, their family.
Right.
As a professional historian, if I go to archives, there's usually 10 people in line in the morning, and 9 of them are doing genealogy. People are interested in that particular narrow aspect of their family history, usually, especially Americans, because some of us, like me, once you get back to the old world, who knows who was where, and it's hard to tell.
It's funny you said that, because I have some friends who are social workers, and they will say many times, adopted children who have never known their parents, one of the things they always get to when they get to a certain age is they crave and they have a hunger for the history of who they are.
Just the curiosity.
Yeah, it's a curiosity. That's a natural thing in human beings, to have this curiosity of, why am I here? What came before me, and what made me who I am? Why do I have blue eyes and blonde hair? But what makes me a Christian? What makes me a believer? All these things are really integral to our human person. And that's exactly what history does.
And so institutions have a history too. So Aquinas College has a history as a Dominican college, and it has a history of requiring 8 theology classes in the 1950s and 1 by the 1990s. And it's like a lot of institutions in the church and a lot of people. So I'm happy to say that in the time I've been at Aquinas, I've seen it definitely on the uptick in its Catholic identity in all kinds of ways. And even Thomas Aquinas had said there's things that must be changed gradually.
Exactly.
And if you listen to Pope Francis, he has something to deal with the Curia.
Exactly.
And if you know church history, you know that there's some ups and downs in church history.
More than a few.
And so like our personal ups and downs.
That's
so
right.
Once you realize that about a college like Aquinas, you can place it in church history, and you have this wonderful Catholic college that I'd like everybody to consider sending their teenagers to, and their children, and taking classes at.
That'd be wonderful.
Every Catholic we get, every believing Christian we get, helps build the culture of the college and cultural memory, I would say.
Let's turn a little bit now, John, just so we can, some personal achievements that you have right now.
Okay.
I know the fact that you have a Holy Family Radio, you do a show called Faith and Reason, and that really explores a lot of the in-depth theological and intellectual understanding of our church, correct?
Yes, my good friend Michael Fiorenzo helps produce the show and helps get the guests for me. He has a lot of work for the show, and it wouldn't run without him for sure. And my idea behind creating the show Faith and Reason was inspired, I would say, by growing up. Now you'll know I really wasn't a normal child, watching William F. Buckley's Firing Line when I was a kid, and I liked the civic debate, and I liked the seriousness of it and the intellectual heft of it.
Yes.
And I liked that atmosphere, and so what I wanted to do with Faith and Reason was to interview the kinds of people who Catholics should know or should read, but maybe they don't because they're professors or scholars or lesser known folks, and so the idea was not to have famous apologists, which we've done, and famous radio personalities, which we've also done on the show, but mainly to see where there's good people doing things and shed a little more light on what they're doing, because everybody should know the history and philosophy and theology, and to just have a deep intellectual show like that.
Well, I had the privilege of interviewing you,
and our one and only guest host.
One and only guest host on your show. But let's talk about the book that I interviewed you on, because it's something you've won an award on. So tell us about that book.
Okay, my newest book, I have 2 books on the Mexican-American War. The first was Manifest Ambition, and it was about Polk and government relations during the war.
Right.
The newest one is called Missionaries of Republicanism,
Okay.
A Religious History of the Mexican-American War. The title comes from a quote by the same man who coined the phrase manifest destiny, and he said the U.S. soldiers would be missionaries of republicanism when they go to Mexico. So the idea behind the book is exploring the ways most Americans at the time who were white and Protestant looked at Mexico as a backward Catholic
That's right.
nation and were afraid that that might happen to the United States if there was too much Catholic immigration, especially Irish Catholic immigration. And so they had difficulty conceiving of religious liberty to mean anything other than really Protestant religious liberty, and American identity meant you really had to be Protestant, because if you were a good Catholic, you'd be a bad Republican. That is, you would not be able to participate in democracy
Exactly.
in a good and healthy way. And the Texas Catholic Historical Society has named that book its Father Paul Foyk Award, which is their annual award for the best book
Well,
on
congratulations.
the Catholic history of the Southwest. So happy to talk about that.
And that's out in print right now.
It's out in print right now from Oxford University Press, and you could get that on. Can I plug the book on the show?
Absolutely.
It's too late now.
Absolutely. No.
On Amazon or from Oxford or
Give,
Barnes
give
and
us a
Noble.
title again.
Missionaries of Republicanism,
Okay.
a religious history of the Mexican-American War.
Okay.
So it's kind of a long academic title, but hopefully it doesn't read overly academic.
Yeah. How long did it take you to put that book together?
Well, I wrote some of this book was written before I wrote the last book,
Sure.
and participated in other projects like Catholic Studies and starting up the Rome semester program at Aquinas. And there's lots of draws on my time. But this book originally, part of it was my dissertation way back in 2001.
Really?
So I've been fiddling around with the topic for years and years and working on it slowly. And of all things, it was a seminar in Christian scholarship that I won through a fellowship at Calvin College here in town, where I spent a summer and worked with Harry Stout from Yale University, who's a Jonathan Edwards Professor of Religious History at Yale. And we worked together, and he really gave the book a big boost with some new ideas, new questions to ask, and
Wonderful.
And on it went.
Did you ever envision yourself an author?
No, not when I was in college. I always knew I wanted to do history. I always loved history since I was a kid. I used to listen to Johnny Horton songs when I was a kid, and my mom used to read Longfellow poems to me, the
Really?
Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, that kind
yes.
of thing. But as far as a history professor, then maybe by the time I was done finishing my bachelor's degree, I thought I'd be a history teacher. And I taught a Josephite school for 2 years in Santa Barbara County.
Interesting.
But teenagers were not my true vocation, as I discovered.
You know, it's when you look back, you have to see God's hands on all of this, because your journey is unique, as everyone's is. But it really, it's a beautiful journey of letting you rediscover who He is, what your Catholicism means to you, and then bringing it to a whole different level.
Yes.
Really, bringing the excitement back to your students, and it's a marvelous thing, because I only hope your students realize how wonderful it is to have a professor like you to be able to teach them, who brings that faith alive and really brings that history alive, to help them understand that their journey is important.
Well, I hope, our whole history department, we're all published scholars and committed Christians.
Yes.
And we like to think our scholarship makes us better teachers.
That's right.
That's the model for a liberal arts college.
Yes.
We call it teaching scholars.
Wonderful.
So we're teachers, but our research ought to be somehow informing the classroom as well.
John, I wish we had more time, but we're running out of time. But it's been a pleasure to have you here, and I wish you Godspeed in all you do, because really it's a wonderful journey, and you're doing. Thanks be to God that your students have you there. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me on the
You're
program.
so welcome.
Yes.
I want to thank everybody for watching, and as always, we give all praise to Jesus Christ in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Tibi